think we're live. Okay, welcome to The Socialist Legacy. I'm Reed Kane, and today we are going to discuss an article by Seth Ackerman from Jacobin magazine titled A Blueprint for a New Party. Before I get to that, I just wanted to mention a few things. So we are streaming here on the Sublation Media Twitch page every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're watching this after the fact, you can join us live and engage in the chat if you'd like. I should mention also that Sublation Media has a Patreon account that you can support. I think it's patreon.com/Sublation Media. Socialist Legacy, this project, also has its own Patreon account. And if you subscribe to that, for a subscription price of as low as $1 a month, I will soon be initiating a series of Patreon exclusive videos discussing. Well, I actually have two separate video series planned. One is sort of a reboot of a series I was doing on the Patreon previously, in which I was reading through Hal Draper's 5-volume study, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution. I am going to reinitiate that, but instead of actually reading through the text, I'm going to kind of present a sort of summary and my reflections on the text as I work through it, similar to what I've been doing on these streams so far. So I'm planning on doing that series as a live stream about probably once a month. I would like to do maybe at least once a month. I might try to do more. We'll see how it goes, but I don't want to overcommit myself. I haven't decided exactly what the time of those streams is going to be. I would like to do it at the same time every broadcast, but I'm not sure if that's going to work out yet. But if you would like to know more about that, you can sign up on the Patreon page. I plan to start doing those streams in July, probably around the second week of July, so about a month from now. In addition to those streams, I will alternately also be streaming my thoughts as I read through the collected works of Marx and Engels as part of a kind of intensive research project. So again, I will give more details about that in the future, and I'll probably kind of trade off those two different subject matters on the Patreon streams, every month or every 2 weeks, depending on how frequently I'm able to do them. So if you're interested, again, you can find the Patreon page, patreon.com/Socialist Legacy, to find out more. Okay, so without further ado, today we are discussing this article by Seth Ackerman from the fall or winter 2016 issue of Jacobin magazine. The article, as I said, is called A Blueprint for a New Party, and the issue in which it's contained is called The Party We Need. The issue, as well as the article, were published. The issue was published, and the article was also published on the Jacobin magazine website on Election Day 2016. This is something I mentioned in the first stream I did for Sublation's Twitch channel, and I've been sort of building up to a discussion of this article in the previous two sessions by looking at Marx and Engels and their conception of the proletarian party. And today I'm looking at this article. I'm working on an article of my own for Sublation magazine on specifically on Ackerman's plan for, or model for, a new kind of party as he articulates it. And I'm using Ackerman as a sort of microcosm of a broader problem on the contemporary left, and specifically in the DSA and Jacobin milieu, which is confusion over what the content of an independent working class politics, and specifically a proletarian socialist politics, is, such that it requires or may not require the independent political organization of the working class. So in the article, I'll probably go into a little bit more detail about the kind of broader presentation of Jacobins, of that Jacobin issue. I already discussed it a little bit in a previous stream. But to just kind of dive right in so we can get to the discussion, I don't want to take too much time here. The issue, as I said, was published on election day. So it was published before anyone knew that Donald Trump was going to win the election. It was published, on the one hand, in the aftermath of the Sanders campaign's relative success, its surprising traction, and on the other hand, the seeming inevitability of a Hillary Clinton presidency. So it's Jacobin's attempt to sort of lay out a vision for the political trajectory of DSA and the left more broadly in that context, in the context of a Hillary Clinton presidency, but also the changed terrain of a left politics after the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was seen in those circles as well as more broadly as a transformative event, a kind of something that had never, something that a lot of people hadn't seen in their lifetimes, perhaps something that hadn't existed for a very long time, which was a serious challenge to the political mainstream from an avowed socialist. So Ackerman sets up his article on these terms, discussing the unexpected success of the Sanders campaign as having revived hope that a serious electoral politics to the left of the Democratic Party might be possible. And right from the outset here, the stakes of Ackerman's presentation are laid out pretty clearly. Namely, what he is interested in clarifying and helping to advance is just that, a politics to an electoral politics, a serious electoral politics to the left of the Democratic Party. He also puts it the Democratic Party, he also puts it that as an independent left-wing party rooted in the working class. So from this formulation, we can already see that for Ackerman, the Democratic Party, and again, this isn't unique to him, this is pretty common, but the Democratic Party is regarded as left-wing. And what is sought is something farther left, on the left flank of the Democratic Party, something more radically left-wing, as it were. An independent left-wing party rooted in the working class, namely rooted in the trade union constituency of the Democratic Party. And this is along the lines of the Labor Party USA project of the 1990s, which Ackerman invokes. He clarifies that the reason he points to the need to root such a party in the working class is that on the left, only unions have the scale, experience, resources, and connections with millions of workers needed to mount a permanent nationwide electoral project. So I want to kind of begin by saying, while I'm kind of coming at this article from a Marxist perspective, in the sense that I'm seeking to contrast what Ackerman is presenting as a model to be taken up politically with the concept of the party in Marx and Engels and their various models of the party that they were involved with and that they articulated throughout their careers. I don't I don't know if Ackerman considers himself to be a Marxist. He certainly doesn't describe himself as such in this article, nor does he present this model as a Marxist approach to building a political party. And I don't want to kind of fault Ackerman for failing to live up to a standard that he doesn't want to apply to himself. And frankly, he may think of himself as a socialist. Certainly, Jacobin magazine is, its self-understanding is as a socialist magazine, a as a kind of intellectual um, counterpart to the activist DSA, Democratic Socialist of America organization. So there is some sense of socialism here, although Ackerman gives that a sort of a light touch. What he's seeking explicitly is, as I just said, this party to the left of the Democrats, rooted in the working class. But rooted in the working class is a kind of important formulation here. I would say that, at least from the Marxist perspective, here priorities are reversed. What is sought is a serious electoral project, and unions are the only substantial means that might serve that end. So the interest in the working class and in unions is as a means to the end of building this serious electoral project to the left of the Democrats. Rather than seeking to develop the consciousness of working class struggle to the point of recognizing the necessity of the struggle for political power by the working class, by engaging with the sections of the working class already organized, however problematically, around the pursuit of their class interests and struggle with their employers and the state in the unions, Ackerman is trying to do something different. He's trying to do something different than that. And his interest in the working class and the unions is different from what, say, a Marxist approach would be, based on what we looked at in the previous sessions. So Ackerman describes different approaches that might be taken to this sort of effort that have been taken in the past, and in the present. The two main approaches being a third party, and the kind of go-to example is generally the Green Party, but there's also the example of the Labor Party USA, which we'll discuss in a moment. And then there's the kind of countervailing approach of attempting to change the Democratic Party from within, to try to intervene in the Democratic Party to make it a more left-wing party, or to strengthen its left wing, displace its more conservative leadership. Ackerman, by contrast, sees issues with both of these approaches and proposes a new approach standing neither wholly inside nor wholly outside the Democratic Party. And in doing so, he also kind of identifies tacitly this new approach with new electoral strategies. So there's his new approach to party building is a new approach to electoral strategy. There's a conflation of the party question and that of electoral strategy, and we'll see that in action a little bit more coming up. So there are two fundamental problems facing third parties that Ackerman sees as rendering them, if not inviolable, at least not the ideal approach. And those are the spoiler effect and the exceptional character of the American party system and the highly repressive laws that undergird it. So the Labor Party USA effort was a failure, ultimately, and Ackerman is interested in this failure as an example of why the third party approach is untenable, in his opinion, or at least not ideal, not the ideal approach. But he also has a lot of positive things to say about the Labor Party example. So the Labor Party USA failed to attract enough support from major national unions due to the risk of spoiling elections contested by anti-labor Republicans, thereby undermining what political and legal protection of the unions already exists, or thereby threatening to undermine that protection. Nonetheless, its founders were right, in Ackerman's assessment, to believe that a genuinely independent party, rather than a merely informal faction of the Democrats, is indispensable to successful working class politics. So Ackerman thinks that an independent party is necessary, and he contrasts that to a mere informal faction. I think there's an interesting something interesting about phrasing it that way based on the conclusions he comes to. The question then is what constitutes that independence? This is the topic we addressed at length in the last session. Um, and so Ackerman has, his own idea of, or he has his own, what he means by independence. He will go on to explain. So he lists a number of lessons of the Labor Party experience. The first being that a true working class party must be democratic and member controlled, although he doesn't really elaborate on what about the experience of the Labor Party leads to this lesson being drawn. He said, so member control is supposed to give working people the confidence that the party is genuinely acting on their behalf because it is accountable to them or to people like them if they're not members. If they're looking on from without, they see it as a party controlled by their peers, people that, they share common interests with, commonalities with. But rather than this kind of, way of framing it, and it's not that, that's not necessarily an important aspect of a democratic organization. From the Marxist perspective, as we looked at previously, the reason you need a democratic organization is really because the party should become a site of struggle, contestation, argument, conflict within the working class movement itself over what actions should be taken on behalf of the working class as a whole, the entire class, which is not yet organized, but which is the goal is to organize the class as a whole, over what is in the interests of this class, such that the party is seeking to lead the class, organize the class. For Marx, what must be clarified, requiring internal democracy, is that it is not some specific set of reforms or outcomes, but the ability to govern the affairs of society itself by taking power, taking responsibility for its own conditions of existence. So the point being, you don't need internal democracy to deliberate over what the demands being raised are per se. I mean, that is something that would be, at issue. But ultimately, what is at issue is clarifying this task of the party, and clarifying it both in the sense of constituting the party, so constituting it as an independent party seeking political power, but also in the sense of dealing with the inevitable development within the party of tendencies to deviate from that goal and to instead seek to reconcile to the capitalist parties and the capitalist state, the tendency to abandon this goal in favor of a more, a reformist approach, if you will. So the next lesson that Ackerman draws is that the party must be independent, determining its own platform and educating around it. So by independence, what Ackerman means is determining its own platform, that the party determines its own platform, or really the membership of the party determines its own platform, which in this context, based on what Ackerman will elaborate, means a platform that is distinct from that of the DNC, the Democratic Party's national platform. But rather than this, conception of independence, as we've seen previously, um, the freedom to determine its own platform should be a consequence of the proletarian party's independent position, not the criterion of that independence, but a consequence. And its ability to do so is a possibility because on the one hand, this party owes nothing to any other party. It does not need to appease or meet the demands of any other party. It stands on its own. So it's possible. So it's possible because it has this independent position in that sense, in the sense of not only being a distinct organization, but in the sense of being solely responsible for determining its own program, as Ackerman conceives. But it's also necessary because the party must articulate its distinct political goal. So the reason, the party, the proletarian party in the kind of Marxist conception, of course, determines, or the membership democratically determines the party's platform. And it's able to do this because it stands on its own as an independent organization. But it also needs to do this because it must articulate its distinct political goal. That is what constitutes it as an independent party for Marx. But an independent member-controlled organization more generally could, of course, democratically decide to subordinate itself to another organization in an alliance or compromise, retaining the freedom to determine its own program in the formal sense that it voluntarily entered into that relationship, but relinquishing its class independence by suppressing its commitment to the conquest of political power. So, a party would still be independent by Ackerman's definition if it, as I just put it, relinquished this goal or suppressed its affirmation of this goal in order to um, arrive at some seemingly advantageous compromise or agreement with, say, the Democratic Party or another party. Whereas from the Marxist perspective, um, eliding that goal would be, in a sense, an elision or rather a sacrifice of the independent character of the party. It would be fatal. It is not enough to have a democratic organization whose membership is sociologically working class, then. It is a question of the consciousness of the class embodied in this organization, in the goal for which it is constituted, or the level of this consciousness with respect to the development of the class struggle in general. So it's not just that working class people decide this program, people that are sociologically working class. It's that the working class is setting for itself the task of taking power as a class. That's what constitutes its independence. And then, so Ackerman specifies that the role of the platform is to present a concrete image of what a better society could look like. This is vastly different from the role of the platform for the old socialist parties, the Marxist socialist political parties, which rather raised demands that arose from the working class struggle in seeking to lead that struggle to its conclusion. Demands not for a better society in a kind of general sense of like an abstract image of what a better society would be like, but to address concrete problems affecting working people in this society, emerging in the course of their struggle to exist within society, but more importantly, to overcome the oppressive conditions of their existence and to become masters of the conditions of their own existence, ultimately. The preoccupation with visions or images of a better society was, for Marx and Engels, symptomatic of a primitive stage of the development of the class struggle, in which the negation of existing reality required acts of imagination rather than rather than an image of a better society. The mature movement would be concerned with taking responsibility for the continuous transformation of society that was already unfolding, capitalism, to realize its emancipatory potential. But what this would entail was not the immediate concern. In other words, the socialists were not concerned with outlining at any real level of detail, even the most abstract detail, what a socialist society would look like, because that's not the point. The point of socialism is not to achieve this or that particular image or conception of what society should be like, but rather to free society to transform itself in ways that are rendered possible under capitalism, but also obstructed by capitalism. So the working class is capable of grasping a potential for freedom in capitalism that capitalism itself prevents them from realizing. And the struggle for socialism is about overcoming that obstruction through the conquest of political power. Finally, in terms of Ackerman's lessons from the Labor Party, the third lesson is that the party should actually contest elections, and its candidates for public office should be members of the party, accountable to the membership, and pledged to respect the platform. This generates a sense of hope and momentum that this better society might be attainable in practice. But again, it's not that the working class might develop the capacity to take political power into its own hands and lead the transformation of society, but that a better society might be attainable, leaving the means of attaining it underspecified or really unspecified. Presumably, the means, or not necessarily the only means, but a crucially important means from Ackerman's perspective would be passing legislation, given his emphasis on elections, on electoral politics. By dominating the legislature or through cooperation with other parties, perhaps. So it's not even clear that what's being sought is to take majority power in the legislature in order to pass the kinds of reforms that the movement wants. Perhaps it's a matter of reaching compromises with the Democratic Party or other parties to achieve that. And of course, there's the question of state power, of executive power. Is that necessary, or is it something that can be undertaken with a Democratic president or a Republican president? If a radical transformation of society is on the table, then what efforts, legal and illegal, civil and violent, to prevent this from happening or to overthrow such an administration if it did take office? So there is this question: if we're talking about a fundamental transformation of society in the interests of the working class, what of efforts to undermine the legitimate political power or electoral and legislative power of this movement by by the existing state, by the ruling class, by the capitalist class? What about that prospect that is not addressed, because the entire question of whether political power would be necessary and what role it would play, and what relation political power, in the sense of executive power, in what relation this stands to power in the legislature, and the relationship between the party in question and other parties. If the goal is not explicitly to take power, but to realize a vision of a better society, which is to say, to win a set of reforms outlined in a platform, then why not try to achieve those reforms through compromise with the existing state and the ruling parties? Wouldn't inviting suppression undermine that goal? So Ackerman then turns to kind of his unique insight as the article is sort of framed around this idea that the what's missing from this list of lessons of the Labor Party is there's no mention of a separate ballot line. So the Labor Party USA was mistaken for Ackerman to assume that it had to have a separate ballot line for its candidates, that they had to be listed on the ballot as Labor Party USA candidates. This gave rise to the spoiler dilemma, threatening to elect Republicans and destroy relationships with Democratic office holders who might otherwise be sympathetic to unions and thus lose the support of the unions that depended on those office holders. The apparent alternative, not running candidates, gave rise to the nagging question: what's the point of having this so called party in the first place? So Ackerman can't imagine what a party would do other than engage in electoral politics, or at least he can't imagine why you would need a party if you were not at least engaging in electoral politics. And this failure of imagination is not unique to Ackerman. This is something this is a kind of a general kind of limitation of political imagination in the present, and he's giving voice to it, and hence to what he sees as a fatal flaw in the strategy that the Labor Party USA ended up taking to avoid this spoiler problem, this problem of splitting the vote between itself and its Democratic competitors, and thereby handing the vote to the Republican. Namely, the strategy of avoiding electoral politics until the party was prepared to seriously contend with the Democrats. But the Democrats and Republicans are active in more than just elections and elected offices themselves. What they do as parties is not simply elect people to office. Both their official functionaries and people they influence through propaganda efforts are active in all spheres of civil society: the media, the schools, both public schools, private schools, higher education, churches, unions, private enterprises, nonprofits, across the board, depending on where you are, of course, and what specific institutions we're talking about. Democrats and or Republicans, often one or the other, tend to have a kind of monopoly on the ideological kind of worldview of participants in those organizations, and hence in the way that public discourse is unfolds within them and through them. The principal task of a political party is not simply to run candidates in elections, and this is, I mean, this is true even of the Democratic and Republican parties. The principal task is not simply to run candidates. Of course, it is essential that they do that, um, but that is not in and of itself the kind of sole concern. There's a broader concern, and running candidates in elections and winning offices and holding offices and doing things with those offices is part of that broader concern, which is namely the concern with propagating its political project and goal. The party is concerned with propagating its political project and goal to promote and educate people about what it believes is politically necessary and how it proposes to do it. While running in and winning elections may be a means of achieving that goal directly, in other words, a means of using the office or the electoral platform to do those things, um, elections are also means of propaganda in this sense of spreading this message and winning support. And then there are, of course, other ways of doing that. Now, this may seem a little bit overwrought in that the Democrats and the Republicans aren't exactly ideologically as ideologically thick as, say, a Marxist social democratic party of the Second International was. But in another sense, they are kind of more swamped with ideological commitments, and not necessarily consistently so, even within, even among their ranks. But there is, first of all, a kind of general commonality with respect to both of these parties in terms of what they're committed to, and that is, above all, preserving the existing society, the existing social order. And of course, they have differing commitments and differing priorities with respect to how to do that, and what aspects of society should be given pride of place over others, and what the problems or threats to that order might be. But ultimately, they kind of agree uh, that the political goal, is to uphold the status quo. And talk of bipartisanship is motivated by this recognition, namely that there is some common task that both of these parties share at some level. And that's something that is, can be brought to recognition, but it's generally politically unnecessary to to kind of bypass various kinds of episodic conflicts over specific issues, to get to that commonality. It's not necessary to do that, at least at present. So if we look back at Johnstone's presentation of the concept of the party for Marx and Engels, there is this concept of the party embryo, the party in the process of formation, the germ or the nucleus of the party. And this was exemplified in a few instances. It was exemplified first in the communist correspondence committees that Marx and Engels were involved in. Then, because of the influence they developed through that activity, the Communist League as a propaganda group, promoting their ideas. So first promoting their ideas among the radical currents, the revolutionary socialist currents, themselves, promoting their ideas to other people interested in these ideas, and committed to these ideas and this politics. And then through the Communist League doing that, but also as well, um, promoting their ideas among working class people through educational societies and newspapers and things of that nature. Furthermore, there is the party in the transcendental or great historical sense. So while on the one hand, and these are kind of two sides of the same coin. In the former sense, we're talking about the party that is, sort of the party as a goal that is being sought by people with a particular theoretical or ideological perspective. Um, and then the party in the transcendental or great historical sense is the phrase that Marx and Engels use to describe their role in the aftermath of the collapse of the revolutions of 1848 and the disintegration of the revolutionary currents, um, that had uh, that had developed up to that point and that had been involved in those revolutions. So, sort of the party in a kind of situation where it's not possible to try to organize the party, where there's sort of like a wasteland, a desert, of potential, the embodiment of, and this was in both cases, the embodiment of Marx's conception of the mission of the working class as a purely theoretical existence, or rather, in this latter case, it's a purely theoretical existence. Of course, in the former case, there's some level of organized activity. Um, so this is the embodiment of Marx's conception of the mission of the working class as a purely theoretical existence, in the form of the theoretical outlook of a société de pensée, or a society of thought, a group of like-minded people, or at most a small organization dedicated to propagating their shared ideas. This was only regarded as the party per se, when there was no party in the ephemeral sense of an actual organization of the working class. So, should such an organization of the working class emerge, the role of such a nucleus would be to participate in it and seek to lead it to ever higher levels of struggle and consciousness, to escalate its struggle by recommending by recommending the the role the that it take up an independent class position, that it seek to organize the working class as a whole, and that it recognize the ultimate necessity of conquering political power. So these are sort of the core elements of what the party nucleus would be urging the real movement and organizations of the working class to grasp and pursue as its task, as its goals. So it would not be urging these things, or insisting upon these things to the point of alienating itself from the working class movement, um, but seek to guide the movement in the right direction while warning of the dangers of doing otherwise. So the point wouldn't be that, if the working class movement is does not grasp this necessity and is not taking this advice to heart, that the movement should be rejected and denounced, and that the organization that whatever forms of organization have come into existence should be, seen as not adequate, as not genuine organizations of the working class, and that rather what the party should do, what this party nucleus should do, would be to constitute an organization that recognizes this necessity, however small and marginal. Um, rather, these guidelines, uh, should prove their value, by being part of that internal discourse of the movement through its democratic deliberation, argument, contestation over vision, goals, strategy. It should be part of that discussion, and it should prove to be consistently good, valuable advice that helps make sense of both victories and defeats, both missteps and successes, and that through that process of helping to clarify what the movement is actually doing, should lend credence to the people promoting those ideas. Um, so in contrast to this approach, the approach of the Marxist party embryo, Engels condemned the sectarianism of their followers in England and America for using their theoretical perspective as a pretense for isolating themselves from the real movement, which was still at a relatively primitive stage. It is possible to work along with the general movement of the working class at every one of its stages without giving up or hiding our own distinct position or even organization. That's Engels. Engels believed that they should, on the contrary, form a core of people who understand the movement and its aims, and who will therefore themselves take over the leadership at a later stage. So the point isn't to try to, intrigue your way into the leadership of this organization, as soon as possible or something like that, but to earn the leading role through, being a consistent participant, dedicated participant that is consistently kind of providing a good, clear, clarifying perspective in the internal life of the organization and movement. This would require them to abandon the effort to recruit members to an organization with the correct program, which is what is kind of understood as sectarian, and instead join the forms of organization that existed and propagate their ideas within it, organized among themselves only to this end. to the end of promoting their ideas, not to constituting the party themselves immediately, as a means of spreading their ideas and influencing the movement. Where the working class movement was yoked to the capitalist parties, the next great step to be accomplished was any move towards a broad united party of their own. So this was the general kind of direction of their advice and guidance, at least at this early stage at which the working class has not yet taken an independent position politically. In our context, that would require winning over the rank and file of the trade unions. And by our context, I'm specifically talking about the American situation, but I think it also applies more broadly. As these are the only meaningful, if cripplingly attenuated and bureaucratically degenerated form of working class organization to a class struggle program of escalating conflict with and refusing to conciliate their employers, of increasing the organization of the working class through closer cooperation between unions and increased efforts to organize the unorganized, and ultimately breaking with the capitalist Democratic Party and building an independent party, even if these efforts go against the better judgment and force the hand of the bureaucratic leadership and create conflict between the rank and file and the bureaucracy. And such conflict would, in fact, be desirable as a means of further escalating and developing the working class struggle and its consciousness of it. The bureaucratic union leaders, whether openly friendly with Democratic Party politicians or resentful and contemptuous of that party, but concerned about the consequences of losing their support and spoiling their candidates, are compelled to take the conservative position by virtue of their organizational role and mandate to preserve their organizations, and hence political and legal conditions favorable to those organizations, to their existence and operation. Yet dependence upon maintaining such favorable conditions and the consequent dominance of the bureaucracy and their conservative outlook is a symptom of and reinforces the relative weakness of the rank and file membership of their struggle. They cannot risk any attacks by the capitalist state because the movement and its organizations would be unable to meet that attack with the force necessary to either combat it or survive and even thrive in spite of it. Ackerman's proposal is adapted to this weakness, and hence the strength of the bureaucracy, seeking to bypass such conservative concerns with a clever workaround. But the task of a pro, of a but the task for a proletarian party embryo would be to work along with the general movement and push the rank and file membership to take their struggle to higher levels in their direct struggles with their employers and in the political struggle, and consequently in their struggle with the leadership of their own inherited organizations by insisting upon the incompatible interests of the workers and the capitalists, the need to intensify the struggle with the capitalists and to unify the workers around their common interests, and ultimately the need for an independent political party for the workers to oppose the parties of the capitalist class and the capitalist state and to ultimately seize political power themselves. Such a movement, emboldened by conflict, and not only by victories, but also defeats, which drive the movement to strike at a higher level to overcome its previous inadequacies, instilling bitterness and contempt in the workers when they see the outcome of a given struggle not as the be all end all or defeat as an occasion to moderate and conciliate, but understand these as mere moments in a broader struggle, a broader process whose ultimate goal is the transformation of society as a whole. The point is not to get involved in electoral politics as quickly as possible, which is what Ackerman's concerned with, but rather to raise consciousness of the need for an independent proletarian party in the real movement by pushing this movement to develop, by escalating its struggle, while educating its participants about the historical conditions and ultimate goal of that struggle. the tasks of the party, and these are the tasks of the party in the process of formation. What is essential is not standing socialist candidates by any means necessary, even if under the banner of capitalist parties, but that the working class movement represents itself in the electoral arena with independent candidates, which means candidates representing the independent interests of the workers as distinct from and opposed to the capitalist class, and representing the struggle of the working class to win political power for itself due to the irreconcilable nature of the conflict with the capitalist class. In other words, it can only be one class. It can't be both working together. It has to be one or the other in power. So the goal is for the working class to put themselves in power, to pursue their interests against the interests of the capitalist class. It is not the platform of a vision of a better society that should distinguish socialist candidates, but their independent class character. Socialist candidates should represent the independent interests and hence political position and aspirations of the working class, their distinct, opposed, ultimately irreconcilable interests as regards those of the capitalist class. Socialist should mean clear independence of and intransigent opposition to the capitalist parties. That's what it should mean to be a socialist, to be a socialist party. There must be a clear line drawn. That's essential. A clear line dividing these two forces in society from each other. An unambiguous distinction. And on that count, an intransigent opposition, not only organizationally in the sense of a distinct organization, but ideologically in the sense of understanding itself as having a goal that is incompatible with the continuing rule of the capitalist class and any kind of cooperation or interrelation with the capitalist parties. So by simply using the Democratic Party ballot line, Ackerman proposes that the spoiler problem would be avoided, as well as the other problem, which is repression, the repression of efforts to run candidates for a third party through preventing them from accessing the ballot or putting obstacles in the way of their doing so. Now, there's a lot more to say, there's not a lot more to say, but there's kind of a second half to this argument. I went into the detail on this spoiler question. The second half is this question of repression. And seeing as how, so we started late, unfortunately, and we're already about 45 minutes out from our end time. So I'm going to say that I'll save the second half of this presentation for the next session. And we can just kind of focus on what I've presented so far. So let's leave it there and we'll pick up next time with the second half. But I don't see anything in the chat. Clint, I don't know if you have any thoughts or questions or anything.
Yeah, I was hoping you could draw out two things that you brought up. So the first one being, or two kind of sort of counterintuitive things that we would get from your presentation. The first one being that by not immediately aiming at political power per se, but like, or let's put it this way, but not aiming at administrating the capitalist state, but not aiming at winning reforms in office. It's actually much more open-ended, the conception of the party, by developing the working class as a social political force itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's about building the class, so to speak, as opposed to winning reforms. And so that's a completely, and so that struck me as that's very different from the way that Ackerman was outlining, the blueprint, the blueprint for a party. And then so I was wondering, maybe if you could like talk about this, like that sort of like different character about like building the class for the possibility of governing,
mm-hmm.
itself. society. And then maybe you could just sort of like bring it home for our audience. What is the difference between a labor party and a socialist party?
Mm-hmm.
Because you were definitely getting at it with like Marx's conception of the party in the grand historical sense that has to win the movement, but also when we talk about like labor's interest and always inserting the class interest, how has that not just become labor racketeering?
Right.
So how is this interest something that goes beyond the immediacies?
Right. Okay, so to the first question, so this gets at an important distinction between social and political action, or social and economic action and political action. And so the kind of the class struggle of the proletariat in its sort of elemental phase before it's conscious of its struggle as a class struggle, as an effort to organize itself as a class and to take political power away from the capitalist class, and not just political power but social power away from the capitalist class. Before the movement kind of reaches that level of consciousness, its struggle will take forms, so elemental forms, in the sense that working class people might struggle to overcome, obviously most primarily economic problems, struggles with their employers, so trade union struggles and struggles that would become trade union struggles are sort of the kind of primary focal point. There's other forms it takes as well. There's many different forms that it takes. The democratic struggle, which is on the one hand itself a kind of political struggle, but also has a social side to it, in the sense that it's an effort of society to make a claim on political power as society, as the people trying to make a claim on political power, on the power of the state as the people, right? But also, all manner of social relationships. Of course, capitalism leads to both the deterioration and disintegration of previous forms of life, previous forms of social relationships on which people depended, and it also creates new problems that never had any kind of means of mitigation and mediation prior. So it's up to the working class people facing these problems to find ways of addressing them, to do something about them, or to just kind of suffer the consequences passively. So kind of mutual insurance schemes, and mutual banking, credit union type organizations, the alternative to taking out loans from the shopkeeper, which was an option but definitely not an ideal option. But also the deterioration of the role of the church and religious life, leaves a massive kind of vacancy at the heart of social life. There is this sort of atomization of the deterioration of the proletarian family, the kind of degradation of the proletarian neighborhoods in the cities, the kind of lack of any kind of meaningful social life, both because of poverty and ensuing conditions like crime and poor hygienic conditions, but also because of the extension of the working day, the lack of free time to engage in recreational social relationships. So these sorts of problems were addressed through all manner of social organizations. Um, you know, Singing clubs, sports clubs, all sorts of different, theater clubs, poetry clubs, literature clubs. There were all manner of different recreational activities organized by the working class to deal with this problem. Um, Education, the need for education. Of course, the working class did not have public education at this point. There was no public education. You either were educated by the church, or if you were upper class, obviously you had resources available to you, but most working class people weren't even educated by the church. They just didn't have any education apart from whatever education they might get in their trade, if they are fortunate enough to still have that kind of relationship to their work, which was, again, that was deteriorating the entire apprenticeship system, and the entire conception of labor as based upon craft skills passed down, by across generations of working people, that was being superseded with the Industrial Revolution as well. So even that kind of education was disappearing. And so you had the emergence of educational organizations, educational societies. And as I said uh, previously, the Communist League operated through organizing these kinds of societies. That was one of the principal ways that that's basically the main thing it did. Um, so there are a variety of different sites of struggle. Of course, there's the unions, there's the cooperatives is another form in which this takes, another attempt to deal with the deteriorating conditions of proletarian labor. And there's consumer cooperatives as well as producer cooperatives. So consumer cooperatives are an attempt to deal with the working people being ripped off by merchants, and to take back that power into their own hands by becoming their own merchants through collective action. So there's a whole host of different forms of organization that emerge from this struggle with these conditions of proletarianization. And the role of the so these are different forms of social action, some of them being economic action, but there's also kind of broader set of social problems and social action to address those problems. Now, the role of the party in all of this is, in a sense, to bring all of this together as a common struggle with a common goal and a common aim, and to organize the movement as a kind of coherent whole with a direction and goal. So, to that extent, of course, there is, for example, running candidates for office, or in situations like the Chartists weren't able to do that, but they did engage in political action in the kind of more in the kind of in a kind of direct sense in petitioning and organizing and demonstrating in favor of democratic reform so that they could run candidates and vote for their candidates. So we'll talk more about that in the next section, because that's kind of a blind spot for Ackerman, that there's more to political action in that sort of restricted sense than just running candidates. But there's also a kind of broader sense in which what the function of running candidates and more generally propagating a political goal and a political project through lectures and publications, newspapers, pamphlets, books, public meetings, all of these sorts of activities. And the election campaign itself being a venue to propagate this message, as well. If you were able to elect candidates to the legislature, that's also a venue to propagate this message and to win people over. The that sort of activity isn't an end in itself, certainly, and it's not sort of the primary activity in and of itself. It's a means to the end of bringing all of that social action together into a common struggle with common aims, cooperating amongst themselves. And then that also takes the form. The kind of electoral process, the electoral campaigns, and other forms of political propaganda are a means of kind of putting an umbrella out there through which this whole movement can kind of come together under a common, you know, identity, if you will. Maybe it's probably not the best word, but a kind of common vehicle, common goal, uniting it. That's not, of course, to say that everyone involved in every one of these organizations is going to agree with that political goal, or at least agree in an unqualified way without any reservations or points of dispute. The point isn't simply to kind of unite in a kind of straightforward, homogenous way. The point is to deal with the differences that are going to arise as workers are exposed to these ideas, and consider them and think about them in the context of the world they're actually living in, the struggles they're actually involved in, the organizations and relations that they're actually standing within. And those disputes, on the one hand, if they become involved in the party, could be mediated through the internal democracy of the party itself. But even if they are on the outside of the party, if they aren't won over to the party, if maybe they vote for the candidates sometimes, but maybe they don't, maybe they're not 100% convinced, they're skeptical, but they're interested, they're kind of in the milieu, but they're not won over to these ideas yet. Nonetheless, all of these various forms of organization themselves become sites of contestation, debate, and even political struggle. So the Socialist Party doesn't just organize candidates to run for elected office in the government or in the legislature, but also organizes candidates to run for elected office within the unions, right? To try to win leadership of the unions and the union federations where they exist and so on. So all of these different organizations are kind of involved in a dialectic with the party that takes that kind of character. So it's a much broader scope of political action than just elections. And even elections themselves have a much kind of broader purpose than just winning certain reforms. And the struggle for reforms shouldn't be left aside. It's important. It's another part of this puzzle. And that we'll get into the next session, because that's a whole nother conversation. But when you leave it at trying to win certain reforms by electing people to the legislature, or maybe eventually the presidency, you're missing really everything. That's kind of the whole heart of the party, is the movement of the working class, the struggle, and not just the movement in a kind of vague sense of, the kind of way movement is used today. It was concrete what was meant by movement. It meant literally the activity of masses of people, organized and unorganized, struggling with the proletarian condition of their existence and seeking to overcome that condition in various ways. And the various ways in which those forms of activity interacted with each other, conflicted with each other, cooperated with each other, built up into higher forms of conflict, higher problems. Okay, and so I'll try to briefly, since I just rambled a bit, deal with this Labor Party question. What's the difference between a Labor Party and a Socialist Party? So, and I want to introduce a kind of a third term here, which would be like a workers' party, or a working men's party would be the phrase in Marx and Engels' time. So Labor Party, generally what's meant by that is a party of the existing labor movement, a party that represents the institutions, the organizations of the existing labor movement. And generally speaking, the leading organizations of the labor movement are the trade unions. And generally speaking, we're not just talking about trade unions kind of en masse, but an organized coalition or federation of the major trade unions, the major forms of these organizations. So a Labor Party, what's generally meant by a Labor Party, is a party representing the trade union movement primarily, but then kind of through that, trying to represent the working class more generally, more broadly. Ideally by also organizing workers economically if they're not already organized, but by recognizing common interests between organized and unorganized workers that are political issues, that unions don't address on their own and that the capitalist parties don't address on their own. So that's kind of what's being sought with a Labor Party. A working men's party, or a workers' party, or a proletarian party, you might say, which isn't in and of itself necessarily socialist, it's a kind of a broader question of what I was discussing in the previous session of class independence, right? So this conception of the political goal of the organization as organizing the working class as a whole to conquer political power as a class. So that's kind of, it's a broader conception. And for that matter, a Labor Party doesn't necessarily have to have as its goal the conquest of political power. Although that's sort of raising the question of what even is the point of having a political party, right? So this is more of a modern problem, that we have parties like third parties that aren't necessarily concerned with taking power, and even major parties that aren't really looking to, that are in a sense presupposing that they will have to cooperate to some degree with their competitors, with their opposition, right? So there is this bipartisan, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of bipartisan conception of politics, that there should be some level of cooperation and cross-party, agreement, and that's necessary for anything to get done. And when the parties are kind of too starkly opposed to each other, when the Democrats and the Republicans are too starkly opposed to each other along ideological lines rather than pragmatically seeking to find common ground to work together on, it leads to a kind of freeze up, a kind of traffic jam of the political system, and it's bad for everyone because nothing gets done, and so on. And I think, I don't have the expertise on, for example, the British context of like the Labour Party, but I have a feeling it's probably there's some kind of similarities there. Although I think there's also an inheritance of a sense of the need for opposite, like a kind of stricter sense of opposition, an opposition party that the Republican Party actually does take up pretty effectively at times in the past few decades, of being the opposition party, saying no to everything, like the Mitch McConnell, nothing gets through the Senate, right? Nothing that they want gets through the Senate. So there is that. But so there is a sense in which a Labor Party might have this more conciliatory approach to capitalist parties based on its leadership. And its leadership is generally, if not the same as the trade union leadership, at least, sees in, along the same, has a kind of a common conception of its political concerns and goals. But in the kind of older context, like the Independent Labour Party in Britain, Engels celebrated its formation as a great achievement for the English working class, so the British working class, after decades of political nullity in which the workers were wedded to the Liberal Party and had no independent position. He saw that as a great achievement, precisely because it represented the workers um, seeking to articulate their own their struggle for political power as an independent force. So if the workers just wanted to, or if the trade unions for that matter, just wanted to get their political interests across, there's no reason they couldn't continue to do that through the Liberal Party. It would be the need to stand independently and to seek political power independently that would make a Labor Party necessary in that regard. And in that sense, a Labor Party is a step in the direction of a socialist party. Now, a socialist party would be like a workers' party, a working men's party that has consciously grasped the ultimate goal that makes it necessary for the workers to conquer political power, namely to overcome capitalism through the abolition of private property, through the socialization of the means of production. That's what constitutes a socialist party, is the recognition that that's why the workers need to conquer political power, to do that, right? And it's not necessarily the case that that if a political party of the working class emerges that meets the kind of criteria of independence that we were discussing, that it would necessarily uniformly agree. I mean, of course, a lot of the workers might agree, and a lot of them might be socialists, but not agree that that's what socialism should mean, right? There might be other conceptions of what socialism would mean that aren't communist in that sense, or aren't, at least, that don't take that road through the dictatorship of the proletariat. But there might be other reasons that you want to see the workers conquer political power. Like maybe you think socialism would come about through independent communes, and what you want, you want the workers to conquer political power, not to like forcibly impose that structure on society, but to, give that opportunity to people so that they would be free to pursue those sorts of voluntary experiments, something like that. So the point Marx and Engels have is that given whatever stage the movement is at, the goal of the party embryo, so to speak, if there is no working class party, would be to urge the movement on to like the next step, the next phase of development, escalate its struggle from its current level to a higher level. So in the case where you have a trade union movement but no independent political organization, the formation of a labor party would be a step forward. It would require further struggle, further clarification, and ultimately it would need to clarify itself, if it's not in the sense of, seeking political power exclusively for itself, it would need to be clarified that that's necessary. And the point would be by undertaking this struggle, that will be clarified. As long as that struggle is pursued forthrightly and rigorously and continuously, as long as the struggle is actually undertaken, and furthermore, its consequences and it's the consciousness of that struggle is hashed out through the internal deliberation and debate amongst the workers, through its democratic organizations, and through its theoretical arguments, its arguments over the theoretical grasp of these problems, working through the ideas of the socialists. This would lead it ultimately to recognize the necessity of the conquest of political power. And that may mean coming up against the labor leaders, against the union bureaucrats, against the party bureaucrats. It may mean having to split and form a new party, or it may mean ousting the current leadership. It could mean a lot of things. And for that matter, even if the party is struggling for political power, it still needs to be clarified that what the ultimate task is. But for Marx and Engels, it's not important that the workers understand that they need to achieve that they need to win political power in order to collectivize or socialize the means of production. That's something that it will inevitably have to deal with if it takes political power. In a certain sense, it doesn't have to be a socialist party per se until it has to do what it has to do, until it's in power. Of course, it
So
would be better if it has an understanding of this ahead of time.
if that was clear from the beginning,
Right.
So
Right.
in terms of getting to that point, though, in terms of reaching that point where the necessity of the use of political power and the socialization of production becomes more manifest, our resident Distard asks, does Republican complete opposition provide an example for what a socialist party would do? Obviously, the Republicans are opportunists and don't seek revolution.
Right. Well, to an extent, right? So this whole conception of an opposition party, a party that stands in opposition to the ruling party, and that so long as it's in opposition, what it's seeking to do is not find ways of collaborating with the ruling party, but to say everything that's wrong about what they're doing so that they can elevate themselves to the point of ultimately taking power away from that ruling party. And through its opposition, undermining the ability of that party to rule or to legislate or to what have you. So in a sense, yeah. So what did the old socialist parties do with elected offices, with elected offices in the legislatures in particular? They stood in intransigent opposition to the ruling parties, and not just the ruling party in the sense of the party actually ruling, but also the other parties of the ruling class. The auxiliary parties of the ruling class. The primary means of standing in opposition was to oppose all efforts of the government to fund itself by passing appropriation bills in the legislature or a budget, right? So every couple years we have this big political crisis because generally the Republican Party refuses to give enough votes to the federal budget for it to pass, and then there's this threat or sometimes even reality of a government shutdown, which has all these consequences of government services not being available and so on. The point would be to kind of have that hanging over the government as a permanent threat, but of course it only becomes a threat when there is a substantial block of opposition. Now, it may be that if there were socialists in Congress, they would, opposing the budget, they would fall in line with the Republicans also opposing the budget and contribute to that crisis, right? So that is, a possibility. But there's also kind of a further extent of this task, right? So it's not just about obstructing attempting to kind of throw a monkey wrench into the efforts of the government to operate by appropriating tax revenue. Because of course they'll find a way around that. Even if there is a substantial opposition, they'll find a way around it. It's also opposition to everything that the that is attempted to be legislated through the legislature. So opposing everything that comes across, every bill that comes across, and making it very explicit through articulate speeches, giving the full context of why this is being opposed and what we represent and what we're trying to do and why we oppose what they're doing and why what they're doing is invidious and deserves to be opposed. And also, for that matter, opposing what the government is doing, what the executive is doing, and making that known through propaganda speeches, essentially. It's not to say that every single thing needs to be opposed. And this gets back to that question of reform. So the way Engels puts it is, there are the questions on which the socialist deputies in the legislature can abandon a purely negative standpoint in the sense of just opposing are very narrowly circumscribed. And the way he puts it is that it's essentially questions where the state is seeking to limit the freedom of the capitalists with respect to the workers. So, for example, limiting the working day, right? Or imposing labor legislation that requires certain standards to be met in the workplace, or things of that nature. So things that strengthen the position of the workers in their economic struggles with the capitalist class, through essentially not making the workers dependent on what the state is doing, but undermining what the capitalists are seeking to do, by essentially creating a conflict between the capitalists and the state that can be further exploited. Or democratic tasks. So civil liberties, for example, opposing efforts to curtail civil liberties, and other kinds of basic bourgeois democratic reforms. But those are the kind of core ones. And in that case, what is happening is, and this may be even with the support and cooperation, this may be even in support and cooperation with capitalist parties like the Republican Party, perhaps, or, in another context, the Democratic Party. But say the Democrats were trying to pass a constitutional amendment to revoke the right to bear arms, right? The socialists would go with the Republicans in trying to block that amendment. Of course, that's an opposition, so that's not a good example. But say the Republicans wanted to pass a bill, kind of giving wider berth to the right to bear arms, which isn't likely to happen. But say they were to do that, the socialists would support that bill, at least assuming there isn't, something riding on the bill that would make it objectionable. Some kind of, the way bills are constructed so that it's like a million different things bundled together. But anyway, the point being, that may even be with collaboration of the bourgeoisie, to the extent that they stand for the revolutionary principles of this society against the state. So in other words, the socialists may vote with, they may support something that limits the power of the capitalists, and in that sense creates by which the state limits the power of the capitalists and thereby creates a conflict between the state and the capitalists, and an advantage for the workers. And they may also support something that limits the power of the state with respect to society. And they may go with certain capitalist or bourgeois elements in support of that, to the extent that it limits the power of the state. But the fundamental thing, and Marx and Engels say this is the first, and I think it's the first and fundamental rule of our party tactics, is to never, ever vote for anything that gives more power to the state. And that means, above all, giving funding to the state through tax revenue. But more generally, anything that increases the power of the state with respect to the working class must be opposed. So anything by which the state would provide something for the workers on which they would thereby become dependent, and thereby politically compromised by their need to maintain that relationship of dependency, say state provided health insurance or health care, would have to be opposed. It would have to be opposed. And that it was on those grounds that the Social Democratic Party in Germany opposed Bismarck's um, insurance schemes, his social insurance schemes, the kind of original welfare state. So,
Socialism as tax and spend liberalism. So Distard asks, what do you think about the minimum wage as a reform? Is it analogous to a 10-hour day?
yeah. Yes. And so okay, this is a great question. And this gets to, so there's a great article by Engels, I think in 1849, 1850, on the 10 hours question. I think that's the title of it. I don't think it's on Marxist.org, but it's in the MECW. I want to do a session on this piece in particular, and maybe a few other shorter pieces, because it's very, very interesting and provocative and very worth delving into. So I think a future session I will probably devote to that. I'll post a link to the text at that point. I don't have one handy now, but if you have access to the MECW, which you can find on Google if you look, it's in one of the volumes. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful, but it's a great text, very worth reading. It's called The 10 Hours Question. And basically what Engels says there is, first of all, the demand for the 10-hour day is a reactionary demand by the workers. It's a reactionary demand. And what he means by that is it's an attempt by the workers to undo the progress of the Industrial Revolution, which has manifested, of course, in one of the forms in which that manifests is the extension of the working day. So what the 10-hour bill represents, or at least with respect to the working class support for it, is that the workers' desire to undo the development of capitalism and return to an earlier stage where they weren't so, oppressed by the conditions of their employment, by the demand that they work 12, 14, 16-hour days. And that's a reactionary demand because what the workers want is to go backward. They want to turn the clock back on society. And furthermore, the workers when this bill was passed didn't have representation in parliament and they didn't have the right to vote. So their support was in the form of petitions and demonstrations. But the party that did pass the bill, and Engels says evidence that this is reactionary, is in the form of the party that passed it, which was the Tories, the Conservative Party, who didn't do it because they love the workers. They are bloodsuckers that are exploiting the workers just as much as the capitalists are. They did it for their own political advantage. So to win popular support among the workers in their political struggle with the the capitalist party, so like the kind of aristocratic landlord Tory party, is seeking to win a political advantage in its political conflict with the capitalist party, the Whig party, I suppose, at the time. And so there is this kind of strange situation where the workers benefit from this, first of all, this conflict within the ruling classes, in which one kind of section of the ruling classes is seeking to use the discontents of the workers by playing them off against the other section of the ruling classes. They're trying to undermine the position of the capitalists and hence improve their own position by doing this. And so part of what the 10-hour bill does is win support from the workers, but it also impedes the efforts of the capitalists to produce profits, to produce surplus value, by compelling them to not appropriate as much absolute surplus value as they would like to. Of course, that encourages the production of relative surplus value, and it ends up backfiring in a sense. But it also backfires because ultimately the 10 hours bill, because it doesn't have consistent political support, because the Tories are just opportunistically putting it out there, and ultimately, first of all, they aren't able to maintain their position of political dominance. But even if they were, they wouldn't necessarily maintain that bill, just because they think it's a principle that should be upheld. They may decide to abandon it. But as they lose power, that the 10 hours bill is it's not revoked, but it is essentially, it's kind of de facto nullified by various circumstances. So Engels basically says, um, you know, what, what should we take from this situation where this gain of the working classes, this apparent gain of the working classes, is now being lost? Well, he says, for one thing, it's a mistake to see this as a gain of the working class because it was not brought about by the action of the working class. The workers supported this bill. They did do things in support of the passage of this bill, but it wasn't their own act bringing this bill about. It wasn't a representation of their political power. In fact, it was a representation of their political thraldom to one of the ruling parties. It was a representation of their being manipulated by one of the ruling parties. So in that sense, it's not, a representation of the strength of the working class. It's a representation of their weakness, their ability to be manipulated. And for that matter, the fact that the bill was unable to be sustained politically is a representation of the fact. It is evidence of the fact that the workers did not have the political power to pass the bill, nor did they have the political power to keep the bill in place, to keep the reform in place. But Engels says, ultimately, the loss of the 10-hour bill is a good thing for the working class. And so he says there's 3 reasons why it's a good thing for the working class. It's a good thing because the organization of the working class, that the extent to which the workers organize themselves in support of this bill, is not lost. In fact, it advances to higher phases beyond that struggle for that specific reform. So that's not lost. That's still there. Furthermore, it shows the workers that if they want reforms in their favor, they have to take political power for themselves in order to make sure that these reforms are passed in the form that they want, and maintained. They can't expect other parties to do it for them. They have to do it for themselves. So it's a lesson in the necessity of independent political action and organization. And third, by unfettering the capitalist production process, because the capitalists are kind of able to extend the working day beyond what this restriction was attempting to impose, it's advancing the contradiction in the sense that it's escalating the productivity of capital and ultimately driving what will become a crisis, an economic crisis, but also a social and political crisis that will give the working class the opportunity to seize political power in a revolutionary situation. So it's making not only the need for independent political organization and action for the working class evident, it's making the necessity for the workers to organize itself as a political force to take power in a revolutionary situation possible and ultimately necessary. So, but what about the fact that it's supposedly a reactionary demand? Well, for Engels, what makes it reactionary is that the workers are dependent on the ruling party to do this for them. In other words, why this is like a regression to an earlier state of affairs is the workers remain in this position of dependency, of inability to do something for themselves, and they rely on someone else to do it for them. What would be progressive with respect to this it's not that, the working day should be long. It's that the workers should be determining the length of the working day for themselves by being in control of the production process, by taking control of the production process for themselves through the conquest of political power and ultimately the socialization of the production process, the socialization of the means of production. So it should be the working class that's determining the length of the working day for itself. That would be progressive. And in that sense, the effort to limit the working day as a demand of the working class in this kind of reactionary form, where it's not yet taking this independent political stand, is an expression of a kind of confused and unclear necessity that they haven't fully reckoned with, but that they're starting to reckon with. So clarifying that necessity would mean clarifying that it's not enough for the existing state to pass this bill. the workers need to take power to constitute state power for themselves and to take this matter into their own hands. That's what's obscurely recognized in the demand for a shortened working day. And for example, in the class struggles in France, Marx says the same thing about the demand for the right to work, right? The right to work in the sense of the guarantee of employment by the state for unemployed workers through the national workshops, which for Marx is, that's an absurdity. It doesn't work. It leads to a political and economic crisis that ultimately undermines the French Revolution in 1848. But concealed within that demand being ultimately, you know, kind of unworkable on its own terms, is the demand of the workers to take the production process into their own hands, to be masters of their own conditions of employment and labor. And so you could say the same thing about the minimum wage, for example. So the minimum wage on its own terms is a reactionary demand. It's a reactionary demand in the sense that it's an attempt to push back against the tendency to depress the wage rate that is inherent in the capitalist production process. It's an attempt to put a safeguard against that tendency. But the point would be that the only way to overcome this problem would be for the working class to conquer political power for themselves. So it's not that like it's bad for the minimum wage to be demanded or something like that. The point would be to clarify this demand as it emerges from the real movement. And to do that, not by telling them what they don't know and why they're wrong, but to put out there, well, it may be the case that, the 10 hours bill isn't going to survive and it's ultimately going to be undermined. And the only way that we can protect this gain, this reform, would be to take political power into our own hands. So that when it does occur that this reform is undermined and lost, the people that were recommending that are proven right. And the path that they were recommending is validated. And that people are won over to what they were recommending, namely the goal of conquering political power. Same thing with the minimum wage. I mean, the minimum wage is by virtue of inflation continuously falling. Even so, insofar as it's not being raised. And even when it's being raised, it's not raised enough to keep up with inflation generally. So, of course, in the same way, the minimum wage cannot but be undermined at continuously, so long as there is inflation, which is now an inevitability. So the point isn't that it's a mistake to fight for the minimum wage. The point is that the only way to get what you're actually trying to achieve by demanding a minimum wage is to take political power as a class and to become masters of the production process for yourselves. There's another example of so Lassalle, who was an opponent of Marx, it was a comrade turned opponent of Marx in the German labor movement. Lassalle's conception of socialism was that the working class should compel the state, the imperial Prussian Bismarckian state, to fund worker cooperatives and in doing so to displace capitalist enterprises and in that way bring about socialism. So socialism would be the replacement of capitalist private enterprises with state-funded worker cooperatives. That's what Lassalle wanted to do. And so in the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx is saying, this is a reactionary demand because it's empowering the state over the working class. But nonetheless, it's one thing when this demand arises from the real movement. So, for example, in 1848, when the French workers take up the demand for national workshops for state-provided employment, it's a reactionary demand, but it's an expression of the effort of the real movement to clarify its struggle for itself. And there is potential for it to be clarified in that extent. The problem with Lassalle is that this is this kind of pet idea that Lassalle has in his sectarian program. And what he's trying to do is impose on the real movement this vision of what is necessary. And so what Marx says is that this is a retrograde step for the movement because what it amounts to is the subordination of the struggle of the working class to this sectarian, this pet sectarian idea. So if the workers were kind of spontaneously demanding this, it would be one thing. But LaSalle organized the working class around his program in order to kind of, by basically, saying like, this is the way forward. This is what has to be done. This is how we get emancipation. This is how we get socialism. It was not that the workers worked through this idea for themselves and came to this conclusion through their struggle. It's that this idea was kind of imposed upon them. And if you know anything about the Lassallean organization, the imposition is quite literal. LaSalle was known as the dictator of the working class, right? He had a very dictatorial approach. What he said goes, right? It wasn't about the workers figuring it out for themselves, coming to their own conclusions through their own activity and deliberation and debate. It was a matter of doing what the wise man tells you is right. And that's what Marx and Engels, above all, reviled about LaSalle and other sectarian socialists. So that's the thing about these reactionary demands, so to speak. The point isn't that they're bad. The point is they're opportunities for clarification. And then the question is how to clarify them. But they're only opportunities for clarification to the extent that they express the development of the working class struggle itself as expressions of its attempt to deal with its problems and become conscious of its problems for itself. When a sectarian organization takes some holdover idea from the past that didn't work in the past and says this is what needs to be done now, and the workers that have no experience in the history of the class struggle in other countries in previous decades and don't know any better than to just, go with what seems persuasive, they're essentially being deprived of the opportunity to learn for themselves why this is a mistake and what is actually at stake here. So
Satisfied with that, Distard? All right. Well, Reed, thank you very much. And in a couple of minutes, we'll be going on to intellectual self-defense. And everybody, you can find Reed every Tuesday, 5 p.m. Eastern. So next week,
also find me on YouTube as well.
Check out the YouTube. There's a lot of good backlog there to everybody watching.
And I'll continue this presentation on Seth Ackerman next week.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all.